Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past. Today on History Calling we're looking at this document and asking, is this Queen Anne Boleyn's last letter, written to her husband Henry VIII while she was a prisoner in the Tower of London, or is it one of history's most famous forged letters? In my latest Six Wives documentary we'll look at everything about this missive, from its provenance to the handwriting displayed in it, to its content and the author's writing style. Along the way, we'll look at what happened to Anne Boleyn in the Tower of London after her shock arrest, and at whether she would even have been allowed to write such a document. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so that YouTube lets you know when I upload. You can also follow me on Instagram, which is linked in the description box, along with some books and TV shows which provide more information about today's topic. If you would like to support me further, you have the option to make a one-off donation using the thanks button below this video. That will enable you to post a customizable and brightly coloured comment and get a one-time animation over the top of the video. It's one of the most famous stories and tragedies of the Tudor era. In 1533, Henry VIII, having abandoned his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and split from the church in Rome, married his mistress, Anne Boleyn. Yet only 3 years later, he cast Anne aside in May of 1536 after she had been unable to give him a son, having instead produced only one daughter, the future Elizabeth I. Anne was arrested on the 2nd of May that year, along with 5 men accused of adultery with her, including her own brother, and after a show trial she was found guilty of said adultery plus treason and executed at the Tower of London on the 19th of May. Henry went on to marry her lady-in-waiting Jane Seymour 11 days later. Flash forward half a millennium, and in the Cotton collection of manuscripts in the modern-day British Library, you can find a letter, heavily damaged by fire, which purports to be from Anne to her husband, and which is dated the 6th of May 1536, 4 days after her arrest. It reads as follows. Sir, your Grace's displeasure and my imprisonment are things so strange unto me, as what to write or what to excuse, I am altogether ignorant. Whereas you send unto me, willing me to confess a truth, and so obtain your favour, by such a one, whom you know to be my ancient and professed enemy. I no sooner received the message by him, than I rightly conceived your meaning. And if, as you say, confessing truth indeed may procure my safety, I shall with all willingness and duty perform your command. But let not your Grace ever imagine that your poor wife will ever be brought to acknowledge a fault where not so much as a thought thereof ever proceeded. And to speak a truth, never prince had wife more loyal in all duty and in all true affection than you have ever found in Anne Boleyn, with which name and place I could willingly have contented myself, if God and your Grace's pleasure had so been pleased. Neither did I at any time so far forget myself in my exaltation or received queenship, but that I always looked for such an alteration as now I find. For the ground of my preferment being on no surer foundation than your Grace's fancy, the least alteration I know was fit and sufficient to draw that fancy to some other subject. You have chosen me from a low estate to be your queen and companion, far beyond my desert or desire. If then you find me worthy of such honour, good your Grace, let not any light fancy or bad counsel of mine enemies withdraw your princely favour from me. Neither let that stain, that unworthy stain of a disloyal heart towards your good Grace, ever cast so foul a blot on your most dutiful wife and the infant princess your daughter. Try me, good king, but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and judges. Yea, let me receive an open trial, for my truth shall fear no open shames. Then shall you see either mine innocency cleared, your suspicion and conscience satisfied, the ignominy and slander of the world stopped, or my guilt openly declared. So that whatsoever God or you may determine of me, your Grace may be freed from an open censure, and mine offence being so lawfully proved, your Grace is at liberty, both before God and man, not only to execute worthy punishment on me as an unfaithful wife, but to follow your affection, already settled on that party, for whose sake I am now as I am, whose name I could some good while since have pointed unto, your grace being not ignorant of my suspicion therein. This is clearly a reference to Jane Seymour. But if you have already determined of me, and that not only my death, but an infamous slander must bring you the enjoying of your desired happiness, then I desire of God that he will pardon your great sin therein, and likewise mine enemies the instruments thereof, and that he will not call you to a strict account for your unprincely and cruel usage of me at his general judgment seat, where both you and myself must shortly appear, and in whose judgment, I doubt not, whatsoever the world may think of me, mine innocence shall be openly known and sufficiently cleared. My last and only request shall be, that myself may only bear the burthen of your grace's displeasure, and that it may not touch the innocent souls of those poor gentlemen whom, as I understand, are likewise in strait imprisonment for my sake. If ever I have found favour in your sight, if ever the name of Anne Boleyn hath been pleasing in your ears, then let me obtain this request, and I will so leave to trouble your grace any further with mine earnest prayers to the Trinity to have your grace in his good keeping, and to direct you in all your actions. From my doleful prison in the Tower, this 6th of May, your most loyal and ever faithful wife, Anne Boleyn. There is then a postscript added in the same handwriting, but which is clearly not part of the letter, for it talks about Anne in the third person. It says, "The king sending a messenger to Queen Anne, being prisoner in the Tower, willing her to confess the truth. She said she could confess no more than she had already said. She must conceal nothing from the king, to whom she did acknowledge herself so much bound for so many favours. For raising her first from a mean woman to be a marquis," this is a reference to when Anne was made Marchioness of Pembroke in her own right in 1532, "next to be his queen, and now, seeing he could bestow no further honour upon her on earth, for purposing to make her, by martyrdom, a saint in heaven." Historians have been going back and forth over the veracity of this letter for centuries. So let's look at what we know about its provenance and at what some writers, I don't have time to look at them all I'm afraid, from the 17th to the 21st centuries have had to say about why they think it was or wasn't written by Anne. First, how is it that we have a complete transcript of a letter which has suffered significant fire damage? The answer is twofold. For one thing, there are no fewer than 6 manuscript copies of this letter, some of which specifically say on them that they are copies. For another, the fire which damaged the version, which is in the Cotton Manuscripts collection, occurred in 1731, by which point the letter had already been published for the best part of a century. It first appeared in print in a book by Edward Herbert, Baron Cherbury, which, although published in 1649 after Herbert's death, had actually been written in the 1630s. This is the earliest known definitive reference to its existence, and we know beyond a reasonable doubt that Herbert transcribed it from the Cotton collection because we have a record of him borrowing the set of documents it appears in 1636. In 1654 it appeared in a book entitled Cabala Sive Scrinia Sacra, and in 1679 it was discussed by Gilbert Burnet in his book The History of the Reformation of the Church of England. There are subtle differences, most notably in the way in which Boleyn is spelt, between the published versions and between the various manuscript copies, but nothing that alters the meaning of the text. Unfortunately, there is no way of knowing which of the manuscript versions came into existence first, or who copied whom. Some of them might be transcripts of a lost original, or of one of the published versions. All we can say for sure is that the Cotton version of the letter was in existence by the 1630s at the latest, and Sandra Vasoli, who has written a short book about this letter, which I'll link below for you, says that one of the manuscripts, which is in the Stowe collection in the British Library, can be traced to 1628 at the latest, because that's when the collection was completed. I'm a little less sure about that myself, as I think it's possible the letter was slotted in afterwards, however she might well be correct. So now that we have a grasp of the letter's rather patchy provenance, let's look at reasons why it might or might not be authentic. The first person to raise concerns over the letter's validity was Edward Herbert himself, and these concerns centred around its origins and the handwriting and style it displayed, all issues which continue to be debated to this day. He told his readers that he had not handled any original, meaning he did not believe the document he saw to be in Anne's own hand, but, quote, thought fit to transcribe here, without other credit yet than that it is said to be found among the papers of Cromwell, then secretary, and for the rest seems ancient and consonant to the matter in question. In other words, Herbert's understanding was that this letter was a copy which could be traced to the belongings of Henry's great favourite Thomas Cromwell, who was himself executed in 1540. If true, this would give the letter considerable credibility. While Anne was kept in the Tower between her arrest and her death, her every move and word were monitored by the ladies charged with attending on her, and by the Governor of the Tower, William Kingston, and the information was passed to Cromwell. If she wrote a letter to her husband, it is entirely possible that Cromwell intercepted it and kept it back from the king to prevent Henry changing his mind about Anne's fate. Cromwell and Anne had a difficult relationship, and there has long been speculation that he helped to bring about her downfall. However, Herbert was by no means sure that the version he was looking at in the Cotton manuscripts was actually that old. It seemed ancient to him, he said, but he was very non-committal about the matter. After all, it wouldn't have been terribly difficult for someone to write out a convincing-looking but fake letter by Anne Boleyn, either in the years immediately after her death or even in the early 17th century, especially if they were able to get a hold of some old paper, and we don't know how the letter came to be in the possession of Sir Robert Cotton, who created the Cotton collection. Even Herbert acknowledged that there was no actual proof that it came from Cromwell's papers, which I think is a point worth emphasising. Yes, that might be part of the letter's journey, but this assertion shouldn't be blindly accepted as fact, as it so often is. I'd also like to address the claim you'll often see made, for example by Alison Weir, that the Cotton version of the letter is headed by the words, "To the King from the Lady in the Tower." This claim had me scratching my head because, as you can see, there isn't a heading on the letter. What there is, however, is a notation on the final folio, which would have formed the outside of the letter when it was folded up, underneath a much later comment referencing Burnet's book. This notation doesn't seem to say the words, "To the King from the Lady in the Tower," however, and I'm unsure where this idea has come from. Possibly it appears on another manuscript version of the letter, or an early published version that I haven't seen, but Weir specifically says she sees it on the Cotton version which you're looking at here. When I look at this piece of paper, however, all I can make out are the words "the lady," possibly followed by a capital A, then a gap caused by damage to the manuscript, then on the next line the words "to the king," followed by an almost illegible word that might say "from," then more manuscript damage, followed by what looks like "of the Tower" rather than "in the Tower." Am I going crazy here? Do other people see different words, or is it available in another primary source that I'm unaware of? Given that this alleged heading has been cited as evidence of the letter's authenticity, it seems like an important point. Weir also says in her book, The Lady in the Tower, that the handwriting is supposedly Thomas Cromwell's, though she gives no source for this information, and I don't feel comfortable making a judgment based on such a tiny amount of text, nor, by the way, did Weir say that she thought it was his. If anything, I would say it just looks like the same hand that wrote the main text of the letter because of how similar these three words are, which appear in both the main text and the notation. You can let me know what you think though. As I've said, I don't think the notation is long enough to really be sure either way. Regarding the handwriting within the letter, here are some authenticated samples of Anne's hand, alongside the Cotton version. They don't look the same to me, with one of the easiest to spot differences being in how she writes and spells her first name. Note the letter E on the end of every verifiable signature of Anne's, the very different ways in which she formed her capital A's whilst Queen and her spiky lowercase n's, as compared to our supposed Anne in the Cotton letter with a less pronounced and softer capital A and rounded lowercase n's. However, there is disagreement among historians as to when the handwriting in the supposed Tower letter might date from. Henry Ellis, writing in the 1820s, felt that the Cotton letter was, quote, certainly in a handwriting of the time of Henry VIII, end quote, though he did not feel that it was an original in Anne's own hand, while James Gardner, writing 60 years later, said that it looked Elizabethan. Susan Bordeaux, in her book on Anne, linked in the description box, writes that, quote, the handwriting doesn't correspond exactly, although it is not radically dissimilar, to Anne's other letters. but it could easily have been transcribed by someone else or written in Anne's own hand, which could have been altered by the distress of her situation." End quote. I respectfully disagree with these assessments. There would have been no reason to dictate it to a lady-in-waiting or anyone else, as that would depersonalise the letter and reduce its emotional impact when it was hopefully read by Henry. Yes, Anne had moments of hysteria during her imprisonment, but she also had times of calm when she would have been perfectly able to write. Nor is there any evidence that the adult Anne had a significant change in handwriting over the course of her life, beyond making the first letter of her name more imposing in her signature after she became queen. Furthermore, the idea that she was so stressed that it affected how she formed her letters falters when we consider that the handwriting is firm and clear and the lines and words evenly spaced, with few errors. Hardly the writing of a woman quivering in fear. Last but not least, the fact that the postscript, which refers to Anne in the third person remember, is in the same handwriting as the letter, but is clearly not part of it, is one of the most obvious indicators that Anne didn't write it, though Vasily thinks it suggests that someone was sent to the Tower to take Anne's dictation and added in the extra paragraph after taking down her letter for her. Again, I can't see what the point of this would be when Anne could just have written the letter herself, and it would be preferable to have anything incriminating she might say written in her own hand, so that she couldn't deny it later on. Now we come to the style of the letter. Again, Herbert expressed reservations about this, writing that, quote, "Whether this letter were elegantly written by her, or any else heretofore, I know as little as what answer might be made thereunto." In other words, he thought the letter might be too elegant to have been composed by Anne, an idea which has been picked up on by many historians since, but with wildly different conclusions. Ellis, who you see on the far right here, argued that the letter was genuine and, quote, "is universally known as one of the finest compositions in the English language," end quote, which I think might be a bit of a stretch. He felt some need to explain how well it had been composed, however, by saying, "That it rises in style above Anne Boleyn's other compositions cannot be disputed, but her situation was one which was likely to rouse a cultivated mind, and there is a character of nature in the letter, a simplicity of expression, and a unity of feeling, which it may be doubted whether genius itself could have feigned." Gardner, however, wrote that the style of the letter, as well as the handwriting, quote, "indicate beyond any reasonable doubt that it was not really either written or composed by Anne Boleyn." One of the Queen's most respected biographers, Eric Ives, also took issue with its contents, and sometimes accusatory and combative tone, saying that it would appear to be wholly improbable for Anne to write that her marriage was built on nothing but the King's fancy, and that her incarceration was the consequence of Henry's affection for Jane. Equally, it would have been totally counterproductive for a Tudor prisoner in the Tower to warn the King, as the letter does, that he is in imminent danger of the judgment of God. Ives' concerns about the exact content of the letter are echoed elsewhere. Historian Gareth Russell, who wrote a blog on this letter, which I'll leave linked below for you, has pointed out that Anne believed she was destined by God to be queen, echoing Ives' statement that she would not have put her position down to Henry's fancy alone. Nor, says Russell, would she have considered herself of low estate, given that she came from one of the greatest aristocratic families in the land and was descended from royalty. He does add, though, that in both cases Anne may have been, quote, "flattering Henry's ego," or using hyperbole, so these abnormalities are not necessarily deal-breakers when it comes to the letter's veracity. In contrast to the argument that the letter simply doesn't sound like Anne, Susan Bordeaux has contended that we have too few documents written by her to form an accurate opinion of what the Queen's writing style was, and that the account we have of her speech after she had been found guilty of the charges against her and sentenced to death, a speech which Bordeaux calls brave and articulate, chimes perfectly with the tone of this letter. Furthermore, she specifically rebuts Ives' argument by saying that Anne's less than demure attitude towards Henry is in line with her known character and with the fact that, as his wife, she would have written to him in much more familiar terms than anyone else. I think she makes fair points that Anne was on intimate terms with Henry, and that we have very few documents known to have been written by her, so that it is indeed stretching it to say that she had a recognisable writing style based on what we've got. However, I'd like to caution you against placing too much emphasis on the speech Anne gave after she'd been found guilty of adultery and treason. The source for it is one of her very earliest biographers, Lancelot de Carl, who was in England in May 1536 as a secretary to the French ambassador, and who wrote an account of Anne's life within a fortnight of her death. I don't want to get waylaid here on the history of her trial speech, so I'm just going to very briefly state that de Carl's report of it isn't as trustworthy as Bordeaux needs it to be in order to make it a reliable standard by which to judge Anne's style. I'm not saying that the general content is incorrect, but the idea that he provides a verbatim record of her speech is highly suspect because there's serious doubt that he was present at her condemnation and his work contains other known errors. Moving on, Vasily again replicates a lot of the arguments we've seen Bordeaux make, and also places a lot of emphasis on the emotional reaction she feels when reading the letter. She has stated that the words on the page were what she would want to say to her husband if he treated her like that, adding that she believes it reads just like an argument between spouses would. While I understand and even share some of these emotional reactions to the letter's content, such reactions have no bearing on a document's authenticity, nor can we generalise how spouses talk to each other, as every marriage is different. Vasily has written in a blog entry for the Anne Boleyn Files website that the words which resonate in the letter were entirely characteristic of Henry and Anne's unique relationship. This is how they fought and made up. This reflects the boldness she used when they loved and argued and loved again. We don't really know how Henry and Anne fought and made up though. As I've already explained, and as Vasily herself acknowledges, there are not many examples of speech or writings that we can ascribe definitively to Anne. Knowledge of the couple's supposed fallings out are mostly limited to the comments made by onlookers, such as the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis. These people might hear a sharp word here and there, or pick up some whispered court gossip and repeat it, but such snippets of information lack context and are likely coloured by their own biases. They were not privy to the inner workings of the royal marriage and to how the king and queen interacted with each other when alone. As a result, neither are we. Next, let's look at the signature on the letter, which stands out for the fact that it reads Anne Boleyn instead of Anne the Queen. This is very unusual. Anne hadn't needed to sign herself with her maiden name since at least 1532, when she was created Marchioness of Pembroke, and even before that, she sometimes signed herself Anne Rochford because her father had been created Earl of Wiltshire in 1529, leading her brother to begin using their father's lower title of Viscount Rochford. Admittedly, this isn't really how titles work. Only sons should be using a father's lower title, not daughters, and so only Anne's brother and sister-in-law should have been using Rochford like a surname at this point, but nevertheless there are instances of Anne doing it too. It is therefore extremely odd that she would revert to Boleyn in 1536, for it suggests that she was recognising that she wasn't Henry's wife, despite having specifically referred to herself as such within the letter, and so wasn't entitled to call herself a queen. This would in turn destroy her daughter's position by making her illegitimate, and negate Anne's use of the word princess to describe Elizabeth. It is all the more bizarre when we consider that she had fought a long battle to obtain the title in the first place, as her predecessor, Catherine of Aragon, had resolutely refused to give it and Henry up, and she'd also had to struggle to have Elizabeth recognised as legitimate at home and abroad. To my mind, those who argue that the letter is genuine have never satisfactorily accounted for this problem. Sandra Vasily says that, of course she would refer to herself in this way, and not as the Queen. She had just made clear the point that their relationship started as Anne and Henry, and she would have it end that way as well. Again, with all respect to Miss Vasily, this just isn't convincing to me, I'm afraid, as it doesn't explain all the reasons I've just given for Anne using the title of Queen, nor would she have wanted the relationship to end, because that would mean her death. The spelling of Boleyn has been flagged as a cause for concern too. Herbert gives it as Bolen, and Cabala Sive Scrinia Sacra has Bullen. The cotton manuscript is damaged over the top of the signature, but we can see the first two letters of the surname, which are given as B-O. Though it is true that Anne favoured Boleyn when writing in English, I'm not particularly concerned about the variations in how the name is spelt, and I don't think it suggests one way or the other whether the letter is genuine. Given that I don't think we have any copy in Anne's own hand, the changes to the spelling could have been made by those who transcribed it to fit in with how the name was commonly spelt during their lifetimes. When I'm writing about Catherine Howard, for instance, I never spell her name Katheryn because that's not a widely used spelling of that name nowadays, even though it's how she herself spelt it in the only letter we have of hers. It's very common for the spelling in historical documents to be modernised to make it easier for an audience to understand, and I think that that can very easily explain the variations we see here. There's a further problem when we consider whether Anne was even allowed to write and send letters from the Tower. We have a letter from William Kingston to Thomas Cromwell which states that she had asked to be allowed to write to Cromwell, but Kingston had refused, instead telling her he would transmit a message to Cromwell for her by word of mouth. There is no other reference in his exhaustive reports of Anne's time in the Tower to any letter or message being sent to the outside world by her, and as Eric Ives has pointed out, the ladies who watched Anne night and day in the Tower were charged with reporting all she said and did, but they made no mention of any such missive, and it certainly could not have been smuggled out. We must ask, though, if the letter is a forgery, who might have created it and why? The answer to both questions is that we don't know. I think we can assume Edward Herbert didn't forge it, given that he questioned its authenticity right away, but that's as much as we can reliably deduce. It could have been created any time from May 1536 onwards, possibly with the intention of selling it. Samantha Smith suggested in her PhD thesis on the history of the 1654 book, Cabala Sive Scrinia Sacra, that it may have been made with the intention of using it to damage the then Queen of England, the unpopular French Catholic Henrietta Maria. By setting Anne up as a Protestant martyr subservient to her husband's will, it provides a very different view of queenship to that which Henrietta Maria's enemies felt she represented, as she was seen as too political and able to control the actions of her husband Charles I. This seems an unlikely reason to create such a document though, and Smith concludes, and I agree, that there is no obvious motive for such a forgery, as no one seems to have gained from it. So where does all this leave us? The strongest evidence that the letter is real, other than the fact that the text clearly states that it is from Anne Boleyn to her husband on the 6th of May 1536, is the supposed connection to Thomas Cromwell, the handwriting in the Cotton version, which looks like it could date to the Tudor era, perhaps even Henry's reign, and the absence of any clear reason why this document might have been forged. On the flip side, this letter only appeared about a century after Anne's death, though her life had been studied and written about before then. We can't actually prove the link to Cromwell. The handwriting is almost certainly not hers, making this letter at best a copy of a lost original. There's no supporting evidence that she was allowed to write from the Tower or did so, and in fact we actually have evidence from Kingston that she was specifically denied her request to write. The signature is bizarre for a woman desperately trying to protect her position as a wife and queen, and the tone is oddly aggressive for someone trying to prevent Henry VIII from killing them. We might counter some of these points by saying that the tone is the result of Anne's personality, her unique position as Henry's wife, and the stress she was under at the time, and it has been pointed out that we can't really know what her writing style was like due to a lack of source material. These points are all just conjecture, however, as is the idea that she dictated the letter to someone else and that the notation on the back of it was written by Thomas Cromwell. For my part, I'm on the fence. I can't see why anyone would fake this document, but I certainly don't think that any of the manuscript versions were actually written by Anne, so at best we have a copy. The writing style, tone and spelling of Boleyn can all be used to argue both sides of this, and so I don't find them particularly helpful in coming to a decision. The odd signature and the letter's weak provenance, combined with the lack of supporting evidence that Anne wrote any letters in the Tower, do give me serious pause for thought, and though I can't 100% make up my mind, I'm leaning towards this being a forgery. What do you think though? Is the letter real or fake? Is it a copy of a lost original, or did the Cotton manuscript actually come out of the Tower of London in May 1536? Let me know in the comments below, and if you'd like to learn more about Anne and the Tudors, try one of these options next. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my wonderful patrons for their generous support of this channel, which helps me to keep making videos like this for you. If you'd like to become a patron and get access to some history calling perks, check out the link to Patreon in the description box. I'll be back next week with a new video, and until then, keep learning.